time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named so his firstborn son, She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. So you got 3 sons now, right? Onan, and Shelah. So it all starts out, this is how the family got going. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for So now is all grown up. Judah gets a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. That's who we were introduced to in Matthew chapter 1. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. We don't know what did, but apparently it was so egregious that he was put to death by God. Now, before I talk about this next part, you have to just understand this. It was custom at that time that if your brother had a wife and your brother died before he was able to have a child with that wife, that it was your obligation as a brother to take his wife to be your wife, to have children with her, and those children would be considered your dead brother's children. They wouldn't be considered your children, it would be your dead brother's children. And this was important, actually, because all the land was divided up according to family lines. And so we didn't want family lines to just be erased, and so it was important if your brother died that you would perpetuate his family line. So you got to understand that to read this next part. So then Judah said to Onan, so Judah, the father, talks to the second son, lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. So you understand what's going on now, right? But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was so wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Often in a sermon I feel the need to comment. In this case, I don't. I mean, this is real life. I mean, you don't expect this to be in the Bible, but here it is. I mean, this is God's word. This is not some, virtuous, pretty picture. This is real life stuff, how God's working. Verse 11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. Normally, Shelah would now take her to be his wife to produce offspring for the 2 brothers. For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So Judah, he's seen every son he's married off to this woman has died. He thinks, man, I don't want my 3rd son to die. And so he sends her away, said, go live as a widow. So he's really mistreating her. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. So now Judah's wife is dead. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah was now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So she sees, man, my father-in-law, he should have already given his son to me as a husband, but he's not doing it, so she takes action. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And they get together, and she conceives, and eventually a baby is born. 2 babies, in fact, twins. Which brings us back to Matthew. There's a whole twisted, sordid story that happens next as well. Now you're intrigued. You may go back and read Genesis 38 on your own. But I bring this out. Now, go back to Matthew chapter 1. Do you see how twisted that was? Right? Judah gives this, he has a wife for his first son who's so wicked he dies, and then the second son does things so wicked that God puts him to death. Judah won't give the 3rd son. He eventually comes along, thinks she's a prostitute, and Judah and her have 2 children together. I want you to think about, why would Matthew want to bring that out as he's writing the genealogy of Jesus. I mean, why? I mean, one of the purposes in ancient history of genealogies is to show the pure bloodline from which this hero emerged. Why would Matthew want to put something so embarrassing into this genealogy? Just think about that for a minute. At any rate, we continue reading. We get to verse 5. Salmon was the father of Boaz, and here's another exception, whose mother was Rahab. What was Rahab known for? She was a prostitute, right? Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. One of the things that she's known for in the Bible is being a foreign wife. She was a Moabitess. The Israelites weren't supposed to marry foreign women. She was one. And Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, now catch this, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. You remember the story in the Bible, right? All David's men are out to war in the springtime. David's at home in the palace. He goes up to the top of his roof one day, and as he's walking around, he happens to look down and sees a beautiful woman sunbathing. And he decides that he wants her. So he calls her in. They get together. She conceives. And now David's got a problem because one of his warriors is out fighting, and he's just gotten his wife pregnant. So he hatches this plan. He says, I know what I'll do. He brings Uriah, that's the husband, back from the battlefield, and he throws his banquet for him. And at the end he says, why don't you go home to your wife? He's thinking to himself, he'll go home, they'll sleep together, and then when she finally gives birth to the child, Uriah will think it's his baby. But you know what? All his compadres are out on the battlefield fighting. And so when David sends him home, he decides not to go home to his wife, but stays just outside the palace and sleeps there. David hears about it. He says, man, what am I going to do now? So he brings him back a second night. He gets him drunk. He says, now go home to your wife. Uriah, even though he's drunk, does not go home because he knows that his brothers are out there fighting, and he couldn't possibly think of going home to his wife. David doesn't know what to do. He hatches another plan. He actually puts a letter in Uriah's hand. He says, bring this to the commander. So he brings this letter. The commander opens it up. David had written on there what the commander should do. When the fighting was at its fiercest, he told the commander of the army that he should have all the troops pull back from Uriah so that Uriah would be killed. And that's exactly what happens.